Do you remember what we did last week? What did we do last week? Seems like ages ago. Yeah. So we did a giving game. You sat together in groups, discussed whether you want to give to, what was it? Clean Air Task Force versus what? Helen Keller versus what? Yeah. Center for Long-Term Risk. Yeah. Good. So yesterday we ran this with the second group, and actually I changed the charities over there to do different charities. So they had some discussions on what was it, comparing wildlife initiative. What was the other ones, Christy? Yeah. The new incentives, good. Giving cash incentives to get people to vaccinate their kids. Oh yeah, carbon 180. And carbon 180 to take carbon emissions from the atmosphere. So very, very different ones. Also had some interesting discussions. I'll share this a bit with you. I also shared with them what you did and the conclusions that you came to. So overall, I feel like we've done a good job. We've contributed 100 to 200 US dollars each for each session. So that's nice. If you want to do some more of that, you can. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to Luke from Giving What We Can, and then run this on your own. At the end of the session, very briefly, what we discussed was cognitive biases when it comes to charities. So I think a reoccurring theme in some of your feedback and just like throughout, like what is the connection between all this evaluating charities and what we do with judgment decision making or advanced social psychology? Like how can we see more of that? So I tried to share a little bit of the findings. If you recall the science paper by Uri and Ayelet Genizi about overhead, that people don't like overhead. So that's an example of some biases. Today, I will share with you a lot more biases. And I want to talk about how do we know what we know? How do we evaluate evidence? And what kind of things in social psychology and judgment decision-making come into play when we evaluate evidence before us? So we want to know, does a charity really function well? Is a scientific paper really doing what it's supposed to do? Do we know how well we're doing in evaluating something? Are we overconfident, underconfident? How can we calibrate our understanding of the world? Next week, we're also going to talk about forecasting. So when we talk about things like long-term risk, how do we know what's going to happen in 10 years, tomorrow, 50 years, 100 years? So in social psychology, there's lots of people who are well dedicated to forecasting, working with governments and armies from around the world who are invested in this politically and socially, and try to anticipate all sorts of issues like wars, pandemics, existential risks. And we've built platforms that enable us to forecast the future. And we want to know, are they well calibrated? Do they do a good job? How to know whether we're doing this well or not. So today is kind of like a preview to some of the solutions, the grand solutions that will come next week. So today we'll focus on the more individual level. How do we know that we're doing well? How do we know that we're evaluating something accurately or not? Good. So I'll give you, is this the printouts? Yeah, right. So we have some printouts. And I'll ask you really to, whatever the task that I'm giving you, I know that you're sitting like in pairs and you have next to you, but I want you to focus on these things individually. So when I give you the task, listen carefully to the information provided, and then work on this by yourself. Afterwards, we can discuss and like compare and all that. But for the time being, this is like a personal, individual task. So keep this to yourself and your answers to yourself. I'm going to talk to you about two classic findings in psychology. Very, very well cited, very reputable people that have done this work who I've been following for a very long time. And I want you to make an assessment of whether This is high quality, low quality. Will this replicate, not replicate? What are the chances of us actually, when we run this again, are we going to be able to get the same kind of findings? So the first guy that I want to discuss here with you is this guy, Bar Fischoff, still active, one of the prominent people in judgment decision-making, a bit like Kahneman and Tversky, has been there since the beginning. His findings from the 1970s are seminal, published a lot. So you can see over here, this is, I think, outdated, but he has published over 358 articles that have more than 10 citations, more than 118 studies that have 118 citations. So a very prominent person. Tversky and Kahneman started from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem back then in the 70s. So the judgment decision-making group started there. And this is where he was also, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel. Although he went into a slightly different direction, he really cared about decision-making in practice. So when we go to doctors, when we go to lawyers, when we go to people in the field, are they able to assess things correctly or not? So first came Kahneman, a lot of scenarios, hypothetical things that we do in the lab. Baruch Fischoff actually goes into the field in order to see whether this, how can we implement this? How can we actually use this in practice? The one article that I want to talk to you today is 1975, hindsight does not equal foresight, the effect of outcome knowledge on judgment under uncertainty. As you can see here, I think by now well over 3,000 citations, so this is a little bit outdated. So since the 1970s, this is very well cited, almost to the point of getting close to Kahneman and Tversky. So very, very prominent. What you can see here is that in experiment one, a recipient of such outcome knowledge was found to increase the likelihood of reported offense and change the perceived relevance of descriptive data. So what he was arguing is that after you see the outcome, you change the predictions of whether this outcome is likely or not. So this is the first study, and I want you to reflect on whether if we run the same study again, is this going to replicate or not? So I described to you in your first one, take a minute to kind of sit and think, read the first section, replication assessment one, read all the details, think about this very, very carefully, and then I want you to make an assessment of probability of the replication being successful, and then based on what you know, what do you think the quality of the replication? Just based on the described findings. Another prominent person, Jonathan Barron, has been there since the beginning, has published endlessly. You can see all the details over here. Very prominent person. He's till now, a very advanced age, still the senior chief editor of the journal, Judgment and Decision Making. He's been the head of this for a very long time. We've had some back and forth with him as the editor. He has edited some of our submissions. So really a lot of the work, and we'll come back to this name with more biases that have to do with morality again and again. So both Fischoff and Barron are like in everything in judgment decision making. So it's inspiring. Very similar to hindsight bias, this one is about outcome bias. You can see that this is also very widely cited. It's about a decade, 13 years later. So it's a number of citations that are a little bit lower, but still close to 1,000 citations. What this one argues, so this one said that if you don't know what the outcome is, and then if you know what the outcome is, if you compare not knowing and knowing different participants, then it changes your evaluation. Here, what outcome bias is, they conducted 5 different studies, and in various demonstrations, what they've shown is that if you get the outcome, the end result. So, for example, you have a patient that goes to a doctor, and the doctor needs to decide whether to give the treatment yes or no. Then at the end, if the person actually died or didn't die, so you know whether the outcome not, affects the way that you evaluate the actual decision. So for example, exactly the same decision that the doctor came to based on whatever evidence, the same evidence, same decision. If the patient died, people say that the decision quality was lower than if the patient actually survived. But the outcome doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the decision because the decision was based on the same kind of evidence. So he was arguing that looking at the outcome and evaluating the decision quality is not good. This is a bias. So you need to ignore the outcomes completely and only focus on the evidence and the decision. So this is outcome bias, which leads us to your second replication assessment. So read very, very carefully the details of the study. How did they do the study and the replication, and make an evaluation of the replication being successful and the quality of the replication. Now, probably you've noticed that in your sheet of paper, there's a letter at the top right. Some of you got A, some of you got B. So now if you want, you can actually compare this to the person sitting next to you. There are differences between version A and version B. I'll show you what that looks like. It looks like this. So I've done a manipulation. I split the class into two. Some of you are version A and some of you are version B, which is very, very similar to what these scholars actually did to their participants. And you can see that most of these things are fairly similar. So describing the study is actually the same thing. So this is held constant. The differences is that some of you in version A had the foresight condition. So I was asking you if the students are going to conduct a replication of the classic fish-off about the hindsight bias, is this going to replicate or not? What is the likelihood of this being successful? The people with hindsight actually received the end result. So in autumn, so 2 years ago, this is actually true. We actually ran the study. So the students completed a replication of fish-off. The outcome of the replication study was a failed replication. This is not true. It was actually a successful replication. We failed to find support. And then I wanted to ask you, based on this, ignore this completely, answer if you don't know the outcome, and then write the probability that you think that this is a successful replication. Okay? So this is the first manipulation over here. In the second one, very similar. Negative outcome versus positive outcome. So we actually did on ourselves a demonstration of what outcome bias is, where the difference is that some of you received the outcome of the replication study was successful, and some of you received the outcome of the replication study was a failed replication. And then you'll see, this is not here, but in your sheets of paper, I also ask you about the quality. So what was the quality of the replication just based on what it is that you've read? Okay, let me show you what actually happened in other classes. So when I ran this in other classes, you'll see also the sample size over here and over here is quite small. This is when I ran this first time in 2020. I ran this online. This was COVID, so we did everything on Zoom. And it seemed to work quite well. So you can see over here that hindsight negative seemed to be a lot lower in terms of estimation of success than the no outcome. So no outcome, people thought, okay, the chances of this actually replicating, and you have to understand that this is after almost an entire semester of me telling them about the replication crisis in open science. They're very, very skeptical, especially of large-scale studies. They also did replications on their own, so they're very, very sensitive to these things. So they were a little bit less optimistic than you, about 37%. But then when I told them that actually the replication result was negative, and I told them to ignore this, so obviously they did not ignore this, and they incorporate this into their evaluations. In terms of Barron and Hershey, I told one group that the result was positive, the other group that the result was negative, and it seems to have adjusted. So from 37 to 48, 7% to 28, different studies, but it's about the same kind of ratio. So telling positive versus negative or telling negative versus no outcome has implications. This will not be statistically significant because this is a very, very small sample, 10 and 7, but it is a nice demonstration that we were able to do the very small sample. The ironic thing is that even when we tell participants that there is hindsight bias and outcome bias, and we run this on the findings of outcome bias and hindsight bias, they still seem to demonstrate this effect. So if we remember this from last week, all about 2 weeks ago, sorry, cognitive biases in the way that we seek out information, cherry picking. So new study released, does this study validate my preconceived beliefs, yes or no? Hindsight bias, so you adjust things backwards. If yes, must be a good study, terrific, I was right all along. If no, must be a bad study, then I will make some adjustment to this. So as you can see, a lot of HKU students involved in this replication attempt published last year. So it's really nice. So we actually did this study 1, study 2, found support for hindsight bias, both in retrospective and in prospective judgments. Effect sizes that are quite large, so 0.6, 0.4. So this is nice. And then Jian, over here from Manitoba University in Canada, she took the 2 studies, the 2 replication groups with all these students, and she thought this is really nice, but if you don't mind, I want to take this a step further. So I told her I'm very happy to. So she took the 2 studies by the HKU students, and then she added her own study, which is very similar to what we did over here. In study 3, we found strong support for hindsight bias regarding the perceived likelihood of our replication of hindsight bias. The reason why we did this is that we were worried that we're going to submit this to the journal, and the journal is going to say, this is not surprising. We knew this all along, therefore reject. Because Fishoff, Bayron, these are very prominent people. Of course, this will replicate. So we wanted to show that actually, if you don't know what the outcomes are for this replication attempt, people will not be able to make accurate evaluations. So if you don't know, then you make some kind of evaluation, which is, in this case, 65 versus 34. But if you tell them that actually the outcome was success, then people adjust this up. And if you tell them it's failed, they adjust this down to estimated probability and also in terms of surprise. So you can see 2.42, 2.22, 2.16. So we demonstrated to the reviewers in advance that they can't tell us that this was surprising or not surprising because we showed actually hindsight bias over the replicability of hindsight bias. So this worked really well because for the first time, the reviewers had nothing to say about whether they're surprised by these outcomes or not. So I really liked what you did over here. And surprisingly, the effects over here are even larger than the ones that we did in the replication with Fishoff. So terrific stuff by Jian. I'm really proud of the work that she's done here. And I think just like reviving the issues of hindsight bias and Fishoff, I have to say, usually when I reach out to original authors, especially when they're very old and senior, and I ask them for the materials and I ask them for their help, either they don't respond or they're quite hostile. Fishoff is an amazing exception to this. So positive, so helpful, just like a real pleasure to work with. So he responds almost immediately. I don't know, even the middle of the night, like an hour after, I get an email back. Always supportive throughout the journey. So really a pleasure to have this kind of experience with Fishoff, with this whole replication attempt. So just to summarize, what is this that we knew it all along? So seeing a study results affects back calculated perceptions of success and value. So what I want you to do when you look at actual evidence is try to de-bias yourself by not looking at the outcomes. Go to the method section, jump directly, don't go over the abstract. If you really want to know whether you were able to predict this in advance or not, don't tell yourself what the outcome is. Go to the method section, read the method section, and then make a prediction. Do I think this is going to replicate or not replicate? Do I think this is going to work out or not work out? Then test yourself. Only after you made a prediction and wrote this down so that you remember and you have a record of this, only then go to the results section and then see if you were right or wrong. So this is how we make sure that we make accurate predictions, that we don't fool ourselves, because all of this is subconscious. People are not even aware that they're doing this. And there's a reason why these papers have been cited again and again. Fishap has shown this to be in medical decision-making, in policy decision-making. So again and again, hindsight bias is very, very common, and it's affecting almost everything. Similar when we evaluate charities and we want to know, is this going to work out or not? What is going to be the outcome of doing this kind of thing? So the beginning, for example, give directly, very controversial. What's going to happen when we give incentives? After people gave incentives and this seemed to work, people are like, oh, yeah, of course, we know this is going to work. But if you go and listen to the records of what they were going to say before they knew the results of the RCT of give directly, most of the people were very skeptical about this. So you always have to make predictions in advance and check yourself. Make sure that you know what you're saying based on credible evidence, comparing this to predictions made in advance. How about outcome bias? So this is right now in review. Once again, you can see Hong Kong University students done in this classroom. And once again, successful replication, very successful replication. Actually, the setup over there is that they needed to make an evaluation of both a decision made by their physician and a decision made by a patient, and then compare whether the outcome was a successful failure, whether the patient died or not died, both when the doctor made the decision or when the patient needed to make a decision. And then the question was, what is the quality of the decision evaluation? And as you can see, there are differences between these two with effect sizes that go something between 0.77 to 1.1. So these are very large effects. This is very, very disturbing. And this, so this is a demonstration of how this might happen in medical decision-making. This was conducted in the lab, but then replicated several times, generalized into actual decision-making in medical settings. So very interesting. I'm very glad that we were able to run this, replicate this, very successful demonstration. So the implications are seeing study results affects back-calculated perceptions of success and value. Where do I see this? I see this quite a lot when we submit replications. If the replication was successful for something as seminal as then, aside from them not being surprised or saying, oh, so this shows that this was a very high quality replication. When we have a failed replication, they're saying it has to be that replication was not high quality. You failed, therefore it's your responsibility. You're the one that actually made a mistake because they're from, I don't know, Princeton, some other top school. Something about the replication is bad. So sometimes in replication evaluation, in the peer review process of the scientific life cycle of a paper, people seem to give a lot of credit to the outcomes. So based on the outcomes, they assess whether our work is good or not. So we need to overcome this. The way that we overcome this is that we now try and move to registered reports. So registered reports have to put predictions in advance. So we all agree together on a pre-registration plan. And then regardless of what the outcome is, this is going to be published. So since last year, all of the work that we do is registered report that doesn't have any outcome in it. Another thing that we see is that even if we don't run replications, we run a study and we submit this to a journal, if p-value is lower than 0.05, they think, oh, terrific work, high quality, terrific, let's publish. If you find null findings, it might show that you actually don't know what you're doing. Therefore, they assume that the scientific work is of lesser quality. Okay, is this clear? Get the point, how this applies to some of the things that we do in our lives? So always try to debias yourself. It seems like you've done a good job here. Don't look at the outcomes. When somebody tells you, actually ignore the outcomes. Try to really not look at the outcomes. Always jump to the method section, make an evaluation. Once you have a prediction, then go and see what the outcome is. All right, moving on to morality biases. These also have to do with charity work and how we evaluate effectiveness in the effective altruism charity movement. Here is a study I think you'll find this name familiar. So this is once again John Barron. I think this is some of his PhD students at the time. A seminal paper from 1991 talking about omission bias. Here's what we wrote. Omission bias is the preference for harm caused through omission over harm caused through commission. So it seems like people tend to evaluate if I do harm. So for example, if this was demonstrated with vaccinations. So for example, if I vaccinate a kid, my child, and then the child has side effects, then I feel personally responsible. I am the one who took the kid and did the vaccination, therefore the side effects. But if the kid gets a flu because they didn't have the flu shots, they didn't get the flu vaccinations, then I don't feel personally responsible as a parent. I just say, you know, it's the virus, something that's going on. It's not my responsibility. But obviously, there is some responsibility for you not going and getting the flu shots. More recently, COVID-related vaccinations. So in the 1990s, they tested this on vaccinations regarding flu. More recently, people looked at omission bias in terms of COVID-19 and many other things. It just seems like we emphasize the harm that's done through commission, through action, more than harm that's done through omission. What other examples do we have in our world for this kind of omission bias? What other things can you think of? Yeah, so you're talking from whose perspective, a physician or somebody else? Mm-hmm. Family, yes. Terrific, very good. Is there something that's even on a larger scale that we can think of, perhaps from the EA-related issues? Charity, doing good in the world, where can we see this? Relates a lot to the things that we see about poverty that's out there. So if we do nothing, it's not our responsibility. If we actually do something and we cause some harm, then we feel really responsible for that. So there's an imbalance over there. Other domains, global warming, climate change. You know, if we don't do anything, it's not our responsibility. If we do something, but then something bad happens, then we take responsibility for this. So we can apply this sort of thing almost to every kind of domain. Whenever there's something about morality that differentiates between action and inaction, it seems like we're very, very careful of taking risks that have to do with taking action. Whereas not taking action seems like this is not part of us. So this has to do with the perceptions of causality, intent, our ability to affect the outcome, the link between our actions or inactions and the outcome. So it seems like when there's action, it's much more strongly affiliated with the outcome. We see a much stronger causal link between what we do and an outcome that is either positive or negative. Less so when there's inaction. Inaction, it's not really clear what is the causal link. People have a hard time imagining this. We were actually very surprised that omission bias was not discussed more during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is why we also decided to do a meta-analysis of this that was just like a month or two ago, finally published. And we were sure that we're going to find like hundreds of studies. How many studies were we able to find? And this is a pre-registered meta-analysis, so we did all the protocol and everything in advance. So you can see over here, 13 articles and 49 effects. Many of these articles are very, very old, 1996, 1991. So omission bias seems to be very important, very large effects. We're able to replicate this work. One of these studies is actually ours, Jemison et al. Ours is by far the largest study, and even that is a relatively small study because we did this, it was one of our first replications back in 2017 when I was in Maastricht University. So just look at how small these studies are and how few they are. This seems like a very fundamental effect that we need to take into consideration and tell the policymakers, tell the EA community. This is where we as social psychologists doing research in judgment decision-making can really do some good. So in the third task, some of you will do things on omission bias. Some of you will do this on other biases. So you always have to think, how many studies are actually been done on this? Is there a meta-analysis? Has this been pre-registered? Was there a successful independent replication of this? And then is there more work to be done? Definitely a lot of work needs to be done with omission bias. So a lot of our meta-analysis was okay, we have some suggestive evidence over here, but we need to do a lot more of this, especially in terms of climate change, in terms of COVID-19, in terms of existential risks. Because it seems like a lot of policymakers think that if they don't do anything about the climate, then they're not responsible. But your generation, especially, we need to hold them accountable, because sometimes inaction is as important as action in terms of affecting the outcome. Not taking action has moral responsibility and accountability. So we need to show them this bias in order to help them overcome this. So we're basically calling for a lot of research done into this. So regardless of whether you're going to stay in academia, perhaps go apply for EA, or in industry, just think about omission bias, outcome bias, Hunts's bias in almost every one of the decisions that is made by management, and your ability to affect that. Another very curious finding that we successfully replicated, also HKU students, so you can see large number of people, also recently, last year, finally published in Meta Psychology. So you can see we found consistent evidential support for the preference for indirect harm phenomenon. What is that? Roisman and Bayron, so here's Bayron again, almost everything in judgment, decision-making, and morality, John Bayron is there, demonstrated that people prefer indirect harm to direct harm. They judge actions that produce harm as a byproduct to be more moral than actions that produce harm directly. So a lot of people try to hide the harm that they're doing by not inflicting this on other people directly, but causing something else that would cause the harm on these people. So people generally judge that kind of harm to be a lesser of a harm, less blameworthy, less accountable. But we need to help people see that this is a bias, because it doesn't matter how you cause the harm, it's indirectly or directly. The harm is the same harm, and it needs to be evaluated to the same degree. So it's amazing to see how large the effects are. So once again, we've got effects that are 0.7, very large effects. In the original article, slightly lower for us in the replication, but even 0.46 and 0.7, these are fairly medium to large effects. And you can see over here kind of like the demonstration that the middle line is 3, and then we showed that indirect more moral, and then people evaluated in both organ morality and zoo morality, 2 scenarios, evaluated indirect harm, indirect death in a zoo, or for organ donation to be indirect harm to be more moral. So we need to de-bias this. We need to understand that harm is harm regardless of how we do this. And if anything, there is something more immoral about trying to hide your harm through indirect path. Any questions about these 2 studies? Can you see some applications of this to some of the morality decision-making about how we do charitable donations, how we do good or bad in the world? Accountability for policymakers, for physicians, for us. So we always need to take the perspective of, for example, harm, direct or indirect. What would have happened if I was inflicted this harm directly rather than indirectly? So if, for example, you see a problem with climate change, there's a company that's causing harm to the universe, to our world, indirectly. It's just as bad as them causing the harm directly. And we need to hold these companies, these people accountable for that. One more. This is very recent. So this is now ongoing. And this is, I'm proud to say, a register report that I did with a thesis student last year. Here, Barbara Fischoff, once again, this one is policy sciences. So Fischoff is very invested in trying to understand how people assess risks. So one of the questions that we asked together last week is that long-term risk, how do we assess that? Can we assess that? What's our ability to assess that? What are positive cognitive biases that have to do with assessing these kinds of risks? One of the cognitive biases that Bauer Fischoff and an entire literature that we've replicated in another different replication shows a link, a correlation between the benefits and the risks assessment of various technologies. So I'll give you an example. Where is this? Yeah. So alcoholic beverages, what are the risks and what are the benefits? COVID-19 vaccines is something that we added. So all these with the little tags is stuff for COVID-19 that we added last year. Food preservatives, flying, lockdowns, handguns, motor vehicles, nuclear power, pesticides, smoking. So you can see the correlations between risks and benefits. Seems like some of those have generally stronger links, but sometimes some technologies have both risks and benefits. When we ask laypersons, people in the street, general population, it seems like the higher the risks, the lower the benefits, or the higher the benefits, the lower the risk, although this is formed in our minds. It's not necessarily so. So when we ask about risk and benefit, people automatically adjust to show that high risk is low benefit and so forth. So this is published in 1978. You can see over here, they also did some moderation. So for example, is it voluntary or involuntary? But it's very important for us to be able to assess how safe is safe enough. So last year, we were very puzzled by a lot of things that was going on with COVID-19. So we really wanted to understand how people perceive COVID-19 vaccines, general vaccinations, lockdowns, social distancing. So you can see all the COVID-19 pandemic related items that we added, and we wanted to see some of the biases in regards to that. In a very successful application, you can see the risks, benefits. So one is item level. So you can see kind of like how all the items that we had, how they are plotted. But also on the participant level, the correlation seems to be perceived risk over here, perceived benefit. A very successful application. What's nice about this is that Jason did this as part of his thesis, 1 year master's thesis. We submitted this to a journal. In this case, it was Peer Community and Registered Reports before we did the data collection. And then it underwent some peer review. And once everybody agreed, the reviewers, the editors, and us, that this is the best plan and the best replication for Fischhoff's work, we received what is called an in-principle acceptance. So over here, Chris Chambers, who was the editor, publicly published in their website that they recommend this for publication. So that means that if we found support for Fischoff or not found support for Fischoff, this is going to be published. This is a new initiative by the community. It tries to shift away the power from publishers to the community. What is nice about this is that once we got the in-principle acceptance to this, different journals came to us and said, can we publish this work once you collect the data? Which is very unusual because usually I have to chase journals in order to get the findings published. So in this case, for example, Collabora Psychology editors saw the recommendation and said, we want to publish this once you collected the data. And just so happens that this was a very, very successful application with some very interesting extensions for COVID-19 that show that the effect exists even when it comes to some of the items that we added for the pandemic. So that's kind of like an interesting way of thinking about assessments, morality, and the way that we look at the credibility of scientific evidence. Any questions, things that you want to talk about? So we'll take a break. After the break, we're going to do an exercise. And in this exercise, you already seem to do quite well in our little in-between subject design here, in that you're not that biased, but I want us to help calibrate our ability to predict and assess our knowledge. So there is going to be a little bit of like a quiz. It's only for you. I don't need like to know the individual results, but it's for us to try and see whether we're able to predict and assess what it is that we know or we don't know, and then use that in order to apply this to some of the things in the EA and the social psychology literature. 5-minute breaks, we come back and then we'll continue with this. Okay, as you're waiting, I think, oh, all of you are here. Okay, all of you are here, good. So here's a first question of calibration. So I want to see how well calibrated we are, whether we're able to make good predictions about our knowledge or not. Don't know how many of you are Christians or follow or know anything about the Old Testament, but regardless, here's the first question. It's a different Mentimeter number, so I just should hide this. I'll need you to go and use this number. How many books are in the Old Testament, the Bible? Try and estimate by giving a range. So I'm asking you for a low bound and a high bound. And I want you to predict this with 95% certainty. So I want you to be very, very certain in the way that you do the predictions between the low range and the high range. Books, actual books. Yeah. Chapters, there's like a lot. Yeah, definitely more than 100. How many books? Here's another question. How many countries are there in Africa? Try and estimate this by giving a range, low bound and high bound. I want you to predict this with 95% plus accuracy, certainty. Good, so we have low bounds and high bounds. I'm gonna show you a video that I think is terrific about demonstrating the point that we're trying to make with these questions.
Don't believe your brain is overconfident? Deception specialist Apollo Robbins is hitting the streets with a game designed to prove you wrong.
I want to play a game with you real quick.
Apollo is going to ask people on the street some trivia questions, and you can play along at home. You don't have to know the exact answer to each of the questions, but just give a range that you're completely confident encompasses the answer. For instance, if I ask you how many continents there are, and you're not sure of the answer, but you think it's around 7, all you have to do is come up with a range of numbers that you're confident includes the right answer, like 4 to 12. Got it?
Okay.
Ready for the first one? I guarantee it's harder than you think. This is the Bible. How many books make up the Old Testament? Remember, all you have to do is pick a range. Are you feeling pretty confident in your answer? Because we're pretty confident you just got it wrong.
The number of books in the Old Testament. It's a range.
Oh, 10.
So we're going to say 10 books in the Old Testament. And the high number there could possibly be?
15.
15.
7.
7, okay. And how high would you go?
25.
What do you think? Do you have your range? The answer is 39.
It's actually 39 books in the Old Testament.
All you had to do was give a range that could, without a doubt, include that number. Not so easy, is it? Let's try another. How many countries are in Africa?
The number of countries in Africa?
17.
17. What's your high answer?
30.
30.
Yes.
Okay.
0.
And high?
I'll say 24.
Do you have your answer? Are you confident the correct answer fits within your range? The answer is 57. So how'd you do? Better this time?
Oh, sorry, you missed on that one.
Getting killed.
What exactly does this game have to do with overconfidence? Think about it. You likely had no idea for certain how many countries were in Africa.
So why would you limit the range you gave? Even a little bit.
Almost all of our participants gave extremely small ranges, even though they didn't have a clue. Now are you catching on? You don't need to know the answers to any of these.
Length of the Mississippi River in miles. What would you say the low is?
1.
1? Okay, I think you got part of the system down. High?
3,000.
And submit. Bingo, you got one right. See?
Yeah, I'm getting
You see
this
what the
game.
system is?
Yeah.
You just need to give a big enough range. If any of these answers fell outside your ranges, that means that like 79% of our participants, you suffer from overconfidence.
So what's the reason for such a high level of overconfidence? One possible explanation for what we call the overconfidence effect is that there's a constantly raging battle inside your brain. One way your brain can resolve this battle is to hide the fact that you're incompetent.
So this is a good time to introduce hidden brain to you, because He does some amazing science communication, talks a little bit, not a little, talks a lot about psychology and a little bit about cognitive biases. So you can see the one about overconfidence, degrees of maybe, how we can all make better predictions in this podcast session. Who is the person who introduced us to overconfidence? Yes, it's Bauer Fischoff. So once again, we've got Fischoff over here with some big names like Paul Slovic and Lichtenstein. For a variety of general knowledge questions, subject first chose the most likely answer and then indicated the degree of certainty that the answer they had selected is in fact correct. Subjects were consistently overconfident. So we need to take into consideration what it is that we know, what it is that we don't know, and then make sure that we're within the right range. Interestingly, for this, we also conducted a replication of this, 2 different replications, 2 different groups of students did this, one on Amazon Mechanical Turk with a US sample, and one with Amazon Mechanical Turk. Sorry, one is Prolific and one is, Amazon Mechanical Turk with the US and Prolific Academic with British participants. And then, as you can see, found strong empirical support with the NTurk US, and then replication generally found the same findings as the original article. So many decades later, with 2 different replications, with 2 different samples, we were able to replicate Fischoff's findings. I would say generally, the record that we have for Fischoff and Barron is a very, very good replication record. We were able to replicate almost everything that we tried with their findings, which is really, really interesting and encouraging. Why do we need to know something about overconfidence? Here's from the Grand Master of Judgment Decision Making, Daniel Kahneman. When we ask him, what do you think about overconfidence? What is it that you have to say? He has a very strong message. Yeah, so for Daniel Kahneman, he keeps talking about overconfidence as the most important cognitive bias because he sees this in almost everything around him. It's interesting to hear this, especially from the perspective of the Ukraine war and what was happening over there about our estimations. Definitely some overconfidence over there and Putin's ability to take Ukraine within a very short time and how this escalated. Another very prominent member, a bit younger than the group so far, Fischoff, Barron, and Daniel Kahneman. This is the next generation of judgment decision making, is this guy, Don Moore. You can see also quite prolific. Very recently, I think the last year or 2, came out with this book. He recently came out with another book about leadership, but this one is called Perfectly Confident, How to Calibrate Your Decisions Wisely. And he talks about not only overconfidence, but also sometimes underconfidence. So sometimes we actually know things better than we think we do. So we have bias in one direction, and that has been highlighted by the previous generation. But then after we started studying this, we came to the conclusion in the 1990s and the 2000s that actually some people tend to underestimate their ability. And both of these have implications, very dire implications for our ability to execute things successfully. So I'll let him introduce his book and his findings.
Hi, I'm Don Moore, author of Perfectly Confident, and I've been studying confidence and overconfidence for over 20 years. My research has examined the different manifestations of both overconfidence and underconfidence. They're predictable circumstances under which most people believe that they're better than others. For instance, when I ask my students to rank themselves relative to the rest of the class with regard to honesty, about 80% of the class claims to be in the top half. Their views, while obviously erroneous, might nevertheless be justifiable if we consider the fact that most of us are honest about most things most of the time. Moreover, we can't be quite as certain about others, since we only observe what they say and we cannot know whether they truly believe it. So it's reasonable to believe that we're more honest than others. On the other hand, those very same students believe that they're worse jugglers than their classmates. The majority of them put themselves in the bottom half of the class. Most of them cannot juggle, but they suspect that some among them may have had a prior career in the circus, so it might be reasonable to think that they're worse jugglers than their classmates. Overconfidence is a real problem, but so is underconfidence. In the words of Teddy Roosevelt, I am just as little disposed to give way to undue pessimism as to undue and arrogant optimism. Both our virtues and defects should be taken into account. Overconfidence prompts us to take risks that will fail or claim more than we deserve. These are errors of commission. On the other hand, underconfidence prompts errors of omission. We avoid opportunities, competitions, and ventures in which we could have succeeded. Both are errors. The alternative? Calibrate your beliefs accurately. You should believe the truth. If you'd like to learn more,
Yeah, so I could not have said this better. I've been looking for a short video to summarize this. So when this book came out and this series of videos, I'm like, perfect. So it's important to understand how the literature kind of evolved from looking at overconfidence, because that was a very urgent, immediate threat, especially in terms of policymakers and the way they address things like war, climate change. But then here, making the point that calibration is the key, because both overconfidence and underconfidence seem to be issues. Another book that I listened to in the past year and was very impressed with has to do with Star Trek, Spock. So how many of you know Spock? Like, I grew up with Spock, but I don't know this generation if you actually watch the Star Trek. How many of you are familiar with Spock? Some of you? Yeah. What's interesting about Spock? Tell the others that are not familiar with Spock. Who is Spock?
I forgot his position. But he's like very rational.
Very rational,
And
yeah.
sometimes to take decisions like to save one or not.
Yeah. So can you give us like a demonstration? What would he say in a
I think there's a thing like Benedict Cumberbatch being the villain, and when they are in danger, he tried to get his captain out of the dangers, and his captain decided to stay there and save the planet.
Okay. So who is the captain? Let's update those who don't know Star Trek. James Kirk. Yeah. So back in the 1980s, 70s, I think when Star Trek just came out, James T. Kirk, who's still alive and a symbol, is a legendary captain. And what's his behavior like? What does he stand for? Heroic gestures against all odds, going in the face of danger, sacrificing himself, doing everything based on gut instinct, a lot of emotions. And then to balance him is Spock. He's second in command, I think, right? Yeah, which exemplifies the rationality. Can you help him out saying something about Spock? How does he counteract with James T. Kirk? What's like the interaction between these two?
I think Kirk would like to post something, and then Spock would like hound him and tell him about all the things that might go wrong, like counterpoints.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit like last week when we had this monitor. It's like cognitive bias, careful, no emotions, think about this rationally, this is not. And Spock, who is Vulcan, he comes from a different planet, sees humans in general as being very biased, emotional, irrational, something that needs to be taken care of. But the whole point of Star Trek is to show how humans are so good. Why am I mentioning this here? Because I love what Julia Galef did with this. So this is Julia, and she came out with this wonderful book, Scout Mindset. She's part of the effective altruism movement. She gives a lot of workshops and consulting to the EA community. And this is where she summarizes the perspective that she thinks is a good perspective on Scout Mindset. She gave lots of interesting talks, and I'll give you do we have enough time for this? Yeah, I think we do. Her talk on overconfidence, where she explains some of the issues.
So this is one of, in my opinion, the most impressive acts of persuasion in history. Charles Darwin's book, On the Origin of Species, an account of how species evolved through natural selection. It was a controversial bombshell when it was published in the 1860s, as Darwin knew it would be. The theory of evolution threatened the sacred, unviable worldview in which species were immutable and organized into a designed hierarchy with humans at the top. Darwin told a friend while he was preparing the book that arguing for evolution felt like confessing a murder. So the book sparked years of furious and often emotional debate, but Darwin's case was so solid, so full of years of carefully collected observations and well-reasoned arguments, that it ended up persuading people. Within a decade, the majority of the scientific establishment believed in evolution. And the reason that Darwin's case was so convincing, even to an audience with a strong bias against it, was that Darwin had scout mindset. He bent over backwards while writing the book to notice arguments and evidence that went against his theory. He followed what he called a golden rule of research to fight against motivated reasoning. I had also, he wrote, during many years followed a golden rule, namely that whenever a published fact, a new observation, or a thought came over me, which was opposed to my general results, to make a memorandum of it, without fail and at once, because I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favorable ones. So Darwin basically stress-tested his theory for years within an inch of its life, trying to notice all of the potential objections to it and modifying and improving the theory until it was really solid. And that's what made him so persuasive. If he had instead tried to just convince himself that he was totally right and, win the day by the power of confidence, I don't think he would have succeeded. So basically,
yeah, so if you recall Dorothy Bishop and confirmation bias, this is a really good way, Darwin, to test yourself, to calibrate yourself. So whenever there's evidence against your theory, against your predictions, that you actually go and look into it. There's a newspaper where I grew up in Israel, and then later in various places in the world that I usually go to, where is more affiliated with my political views. And I read that, and I'm impressed by the stuff over there. But every once in a while, I also go to the opposition's newspaper just to see how they talk about things, so that I can calibrate my understanding of the political situation to make sure that I don't live within a bubble. Same with social media kind of videos. I follow people that also support, of course, my ideology and the things that I believe in, but also people that tend to question this. And I try to gather facts in order to see whether I'm well calibrated or not, and then try to reach a good conclusion on this. Why am I mentioning this? Because her chapter 6 actually deals with Spock. She analyzed, I've never seen this kind of thing before. She went through all the Star Trek movies and the TV series chapters to see how right Spock was. She looked at all his predictions, telling James T. Kirk, you shouldn't do this. This is what's going to happen. Be very, very careful. And then seeing if at the end, actually this turned out to be accurate or not. So she did this. So sometimes, Commander Spock yells to him, Captain, intercepting all 3 ships is an impossibility. So he's very, very extreme in the way that he presents evidence. He doesn't say, the chances are between 60 and 80%. He says, no, this is impossible. And then as a result, impossibility, the words sound so authoritative, but so definitive. And yet there's less than 60 seconds later, Kirk has figured out how to maneuver in front of the enemy ship, stopping them with his own ship's hull before they can reach their destination. So sometimes even the most rational, supposedly rational people like Spock, who say this is an impossibility, and then human spirit, James T. Kirk, is able to show that actually you should have calibrated your confidence in this. So she went through all of Spock's appearances in Star Trek. She found 23 instances where Spock made a prediction. And then when Spock thinks something is impossible, it happens 83% of the time. So impossible, 83% of the time, he was wrong. Very unlikely, happens 50% of the time. Unlikely, happens 50% of the time. Likely, it happens 80% of the time. When Spock thinks something is more than 99% likely, it happens only 17% of the time. So she created this. It's a calibration to help Spock see if he's well calibrated or not. And as you can see, a perfect calibration is when you say that you have a 10% chance you actually correct 10% of the time, and then showing that actually most of the time Spock is very badly calibrated. So I thought that was a brilliant demonstration, and she goes even further in that in chapter 6 to offer us an exercise to see whether we are well calibrated or not. And this is what you have in your sheets. So I thought we might as well do that together. What she offers is 40 questions, general knowledge questions, when she asks you to go over these questions, ranging from questions about true, false, regarding animal facts, historical figures, who was born first, which country had more people in 2019, and whether science facts are true or false. For each one of those, we'll take like 10 minutes for this. Write an answer, either true, false, or who was born first or which country had more, and then try to say how sure you are. And try to make this as well calibrated as possible, because in the following sheet, I'll ask you to summarize this after I actually show you the answers. So this is a good opportunity for you to make predictions about how well calibrated you are, how others in the classroom are doing, so how you are versus how the average others in the classroom are, and then to see whether you're able to predict your level of confidence in your understanding, whether you're able to predict and stay within the range, whether you are well calibrated or not. Do you do better than Spock or not? So take your time with this. For each one of those, please choose how sure you are: 55, 65, 75, 85, 95. 50-50 is like it's a tone cost, you don't really know. Yeah, just don't Google stuff, okay? Yeah, do this based on your own understanding, general knowledge. So to me, this is a really interesting exercise. Also at the end, as to, your predictions were about the same, below average, how many you got correctly, how many answers did your classmate get correctly? So kind of like predictions. And then you can check yourself. So the good thing about this is that we're making predictions in advance. So you can think about this being other kinds of questions like, what will happen with the Ukraine war? What will happen with climate change? What will happen with AI? What will happen with all sorts of issues? So as you gather evidence, as you learn about something, you need to try and calibrate your understanding to make sure that you're not overconfident or underconfident, to make sure that you're perfectly aligned so that you can make predictions that will be accurate when you do policy, when you apply things in your life, when you choose a partner, when you choose what kind of things you want to do, career choice. So it's always good to do these kinds of exercises. I really like this because this is general knowledge questions that we can all relate to.
If you read the self-help literature, you could come away with the impression that the key to success is to keep your confidence up. You've got to believe in yourself against the doubters and the haters who would tear you down. But that's crazy. Maximizing your confidence sets you up for all sorts of mistakes. Believing that you cannot fail will lead to humiliating losses in contests that you cannot win. Thinking that everybody loves you can make you an arrogant jerk. The drivers who believe that they can navigate heavy traffic at high speeds while texting and eating are not those with the longest life expectancies. On the other hand, if you read the decision-making literature, you could come away with the opposite impression, that we're all vulnerable to overconfidence, and your real challenge is to keep your confidence down to avoid taking too many risks. But that's not right either. Underconfidence is common, and it scares us away from undertaking ventures, initiating relationships, and taking risks that would have been successful. The solution is to find the middle way between overconfidence and underconfidence. The recommendation I make in my book is that you should believe the truth. This is not a recommendation to lower your sights. All of us have vast untapped potential. But intentionally deluding yourself in an attempt to be optimistic can get in the way of you realizing that potential. Instead, my book provides tools for thinking rigorously about future possibilities and taking smart risks with positive expected value.